Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for attending today's session. Our panel will focus on three main points. First, the importance of threats to Tibet's river systems, including ecological degradation, development, and human rights. Then, successful and advanced cooperative planning tools and their application in solving real-world management needs. And third, cautionary views on the impacts of unfettered development and extractive policy on indigenous peoples. We will explore all three with an eye to conflict resolution in the increasingly water-scarce South and Southeast Asia region. Following the presentations, we'll open the floor to what we hope is going to be a robust conversation so that we can all walk away with new inspiration and some ideas to explore. But before we dive in, let me just underscore that as the moderator, I feel that my responsibility is as much to facilitate the conversation, but to learn as well. Is at the end of the day, I think we all agree that that's the broader need and goal overall. I also add that if I make water-oriented puns, every single one of them is intended, including the ones that are not intended. So let me first just introduce our panelists, and then we'll really get started. Starting, everybody's sitting somewhere else. Palmo in the middle. Palmo Tenzin is a senior researcher and advocacy officer at the International Campaign for Tibet in Germany. As a Tibetan born in exile, she studied Chinese language and politics and lived in China for 1 year to better understand the Chinese worldview. Palmo is an experienced researcher and policy officer specializing in Chinese politics and contemporary Tibet. At ICT, Palmo focuses on investigating and analyzing developments in Tibet, ranging from land management and environmental policies to religious controls and language policies. She regularly advocates for Tibet's environment and Tibetan voices at UN platforms on climate change, biodiversity, and natural world heritage. Palmo holds degrees in China Studies, Security Studies, and Economics from the Australian National University and the University of Oxford. Marina Mautner is a scientist with the Stockholm Environment Institute in the U.S. Water Program in California. She holds a PhD in hydrologic sciences and master's in water resources engineering, and degrees in environmental social studies and civil and environmental engineering. Marina combines tools across disciplines to analyze hydrologic, sociological, and policy conditions at the basin, regional scale, focusing on environmental sustainability in vulnerable communities in California, Mexico, Latin America, and globally. Pat Jo is a First Nation woman from the Tagish Nation. I'm not going to pronounce that correctly. No. So I'm not going to try. The Killer Whale and Wolfcrest clan, and is a proud citizen of the Kwalin Dun First Nation. She is a teacher, mother, grandmother, and knowledge keeper. She has been an outspoken advocate for her culture, history, beliefs, and values, which she teaches through storytelling. Her expertise includes First Nation traditional law, governance, and social justice. As a former deputy chief and chief land claims and self-government negotiator, she possesses many years of experience in the arenas of politics and business. As a survivor and third-generation student of residential schools, Pat diligently teaches about the legacy of residential schools and the impacts on First Nations. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Franz Metzner, and I work at the International Campaign for Tibet, which is honored to host this panel. And so I thought we would get started with just one warm-up question so that all three panelists, and they'll speak for 1 to 2 minutes to give an overview. We're here for Water Week. We know that there's really an urgent crisis going on globally. The scientific consensus is that 50% of the global population will face water scarcity by 2025. The Tibetan Plateau is crucial to understanding and addressing Asia as a hotspot. In this context, what perspectives and tools need to be better applied to address the crisis?
Okay, I think I'll just first start with the quick question. I think what's important when we're talking about Tibet, Tibetan Plateau in this region, is that often there's a major blind spot, first and foremost, where Tibet and Tibetans are not mentioned in the conversations about this region. And the region can often be spoken about in very high-level scientific terms, implicitly or explicitly excluding mentions of Tibet, Tibetans, and the obvious political status of Tibet as an occupied, ongoing, unresolved territorial conflict. So while there is some merit in talking about the scientific realities, we also have to acknowledge that truly sustainable water and land policy relies on quality information. And this means marrying quantitative data, particularly remote sensing data, with information, qualitative data on the ground. And so that means meeting Tibetans on the ground, respecting their worldviews, taking on understanding their experiences and their observations of changes in the land over time. And then I think on another level, this means also acknowledging the elephant in the room, which is rarely acknowledged when talking about this region, is the political environment where China dictates the way power is distributed and denied to local communities. And this frames the way decisions are made and how policies are enacted on the ground. And then in terms of tools, like I mentioned, there are huge, exciting advances in remote sensing. So I think what we can do in this space is do more to marry the two, remote sensing data with local level knowledge to get a better idea of what's happening on the ground, to ground truth. So that would be my sort of tools. But finally, to close, empowerment and education, because the individuals who live on the land are the best placed and suited to protect their land, because their livelihoods, their identity, their communities rely on it.
Yeah, so I'm at the Stockholm Environment Institute, and a lot of what we do is research and develop tools that look at the interactions between humans and the environmental systems in which we live, right? And I think something that's really important, obviously the data and getting information not only from the Earth system and understanding the hydrologic, geologic, environmental processes that are occurring, but also how people are living in the environment and what we're using the water for, what the demands are. And we also need to understand kind of how that's changing over time. We have somewhat large data sets about historical situations, and now we have more and more data sets about future potential climate models, as well as the future for population changes, changes in species, migratory patterns globally. And so we need to take a lot of those uncertainties and try to understand how they're going to change the situation on the ground for the people living in those areas. And so part of what we like to do is really be able to show a range of scenarios and a range of possibilities so that decisions can be made based on uncertain futures. So I think not only do we need to understand kind of what's happening now, what's the situation, but also what are the possibilities and how the different actions that we might take, policies that we might implement, or actions that different parts of the watershed might take are going to have impacts on different people throughout the watershed.
Need to be better applied to address this crisis. Okay. Where I'm from, I'm next door to Alaska, in case some of you don't know. We have lots of water. But we're facing crisis and fast, permafrost melting. Our animals are suffering. We had hundreds of thousands of fish used to come up the Yukon River. I think it is the 5th largest river in the Yukon. I think my colleague, my youth colleague said, I think there was 160 salmon that came up river. And we have one of the biggest spawning grounds in my traditional territory. So with all that, we have a dam being built, has been built, and has caused some havoc for us, not just for people, but for our animals and our fish. We're studying that. We know it's been a problem for the last 50 years. And with the influx of more people in our traditional territory, this old dam cannot support it. We have faced a lot of colonialism, and but our elders and have fought and fought and fought for us, and we now have a self-government and a land claims agreement. For that, for some of you that does not understand what land claims and self-government agreements means, that we have the right to look after the land and the water and govern ourselves with partnerships with our government. So we did not have a good relationship for the last 100 years. And I'd like to mention here that our Canada and the lower part has been colonized for the last 400 or 500 years. In the Yukon, we've only been 100 years. So, but it's fast. The damage is come fast. And what are we doing about it? We're talking, and if government does anything, they have to consult with us, or federal and YTG in the city, we have to be consulted. And for right now, for me being here, we always believe that you're here for some reason. And I asked myself, why am I here for this Tibet panel? And I thought, well, Whitehorse is going to be building a new dam. It's going to affect all Yukon. It's going to affect all the watershed. It's going to affect the land. And I would like to know how I can be of help. So in our First Nation culture, one of the things that we really, really specialize is on spirituality, that everything is alive. It has a purpose. And that's what I will get into later. So maybe I can, like I said, I know what I learned here will take back to my community. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now we'll transition and have the privilege of hearing some individual presentations from our panelists, and I am going to ask if Palmo can begin, and you guys can step off until she is done, and we'll go through like that.
So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all to speak on the topic of Tibet's water and the environment. But I want to first acknowledge the sad reality that is me, as a Tibetan exile, coming to you to talk about Tibet, when really the ideal people to talk to you are Tibetans from inside Tibet on the ground. Unfortunately, many Tibetans inside Tibet cannot be here to speak freely about this topic of water, of land management, because they would face a real threat of persecution, of arrest, of prosecution, as well as collective punishment for their family and their wider community. So just to get into the topic, I want to set out some of the main themes to set up the conversation. I want to introduce the region of Tibet to you all here, and to explain why Tibet and its water is so significant for at least 1.8 billion people in the region, including downstream countries. Second, I want to outline the climate and environmental risks and the role of government in these policies. Second, the political environment that dictates the way policy is defined. And then fourth, the role of Tibetans, the role of their indigenous Tibetan knowledge and practice. And then I'll close with recommendations. So before we dive into the topic, first I think it's important we define what I mean by Tibet when I talk about Tibet. Since Tibet's invasion in 1950-51 by the Chinese Communist Party, Tibet remains an unresolved conflict. So as a result, the boundaries are contested. When we talk about Tibet, we're referring to the political, historical, cultural, and what is often known as anthropological Tibet as well. And this is the area shaded in red in this map on the right. And you can see this roughly corresponds with the geographic boundary of the Tibetan Plateau, which is defined as a region having an average altitude of 4,500 meters. So what's so interesting about Tibetan water, and why is it important for us to pay attention? Tibet is often called Asia's water tower because it is the source of Asia's 8 great rivers, so the Indus, the Ganges, the Yalungtangpa Brahmaputra River, the Irrawaddy, Salween, Mekong, Yangtze, and Yellow River. So we've all heard of these rivers, and people rarely know where they start from. And this map shows you the river basin systems, and also this huge number, 1.8 billion people who rely on these river systems. So what are the challenges facing Tibet's river systems? So number 1 would be climate change, 2, dams, and 3, grassland degradation and desertification. Of course, there are many more challenges facing this region, but I want to focus on these 3. And I want to highlight the fact that dams and grassland degradation are very much man-made policy. So there's much more we can do in this area to mitigate the effects that these 2 challenges have on exacerbating climate change. So looking deeper at climate change in the region, so what we know is temperatures are rising 2 to 4 times higher than the global average in this region. So the effects are far more severe. Latest data from ICIMO, the International Center for Integrated Development, has found in 2023 that glaciers are accelerating at an increasing rate, melting at an accelerating rate, and accelerating 60% faster than the last decade. And they estimate that the volume of glaciers in this region will melt, about 75% will melt by the end of the century. And you can see from this image I have up here, we had previously used the figure of 36% will be disappeared by the end of the century, and this data has been updated. So this shows you how important it is to do research in this area, to get your information correct so that we can predict and prepare. But overall, 75% of glaciers in this region will have melted by the end of the century. And some of the effects of this are seasonal changes in river flow, which has huge impacts on water downstream. We also have glacial lake expansion and lake outburst floods, which cause huge, tremendous damage to communities downstream, and other common issues such as permafrost thawing and landslides, as well as extreme weather events. So I've just got quickly an image of the distribution of glacial lake outburst floods in this region, and so you can see across the Himalayas there. Next to dams, I want to skip to this next slide where I show the rivers and their tributaries. And I want to highlight here that China has launched, actually in 2000, but it's very much accelerated in the last decade. They've launched a policy or a project called the East to West Power Transmission Project, which aims to turn Tibet into a hydropower network that will export energy, renewable energy from hydropower to eastern and central China to power their manufacturing centers, urban centers. And they will primarily rely on the upstream rivers of the Yangtze, as well as the Yellow, but also the Yalungtangpa at the Great Bend, which some people might know well. And what's concerning to us here is, let me go back to the costs of dams. Here we know that in this region, dams are susceptible to and increase the risks of earthquakes, landslides, and flash floods. They also increase the human footprint, in particular increasing methane pollution, and of course, they interrupt essential aquatic life, soil, and nutrient flows downstream. Dams also cause expulsion of residents from their homes and the destruction of historic sites. And I want to skip here to some sites that we do know of. They've got 3 dams here, from left to right and then down. And actually, most recently, in the second image of the monastery, that has been demolished. to make way for the Yangkil or Yangchu Dam, which has an installed power capacity of 1,200 megawatts. And actually, earlier this year, we had huge demonstrations in Daegu, Kamdo, in Tibet, where we had local communities protesting, and at least some say up to 1,000 local residents incarcerated, detained for protesting the destruction of their local monasteries and their villages. And right now, this region is actually currently locked down, so we can't get information from what's happening in this region. But I just want to give you an image of what this region looks like, the agricultural plains, the vegetation in this area, and the types of communities and the types of traditional historical sites that are going to be flooded by these dams that will really primarily aim to power eastern and central China. The third major factor is grassland degradation, and I won't go into too much detail because of time, but I want to skip now to the political forces that broadly shape Tibetan life and Tibetan land. So I opened up already in this presentation about Tibet's status as an occupied land, but I also want to emphasize the three broad policy projects that are affecting Tibetans right now. And the first is the Development Project, which seeks to modernize, civilize, and render Tibetans governable, essentially. The second project is building the ecological civilization, which of course sounds great, but primarily it's about removing Tibetans from their traditional lands and then closing the land off into nature reserves, a project that has been broadly transplanted from North America. And then the third project is the renewable energy transition, which of course is a welcome endeavor, but what we're seeing is Tibetan renewable resources are being extracted without consultation. So we have to always consider the process as we undertake this climate change and renewable energy transition. So now turning to indigenous knowledge. So what I believe is really, if we are to tackle water sustainability, land use issues in the region, you have to go to the root of the problem, which is very often it is the political issue. Who makes the decisions? Who is best equipped to make decisions about the land that they live on? And when we talk about what would happen if Tibetans were empowered in a counterfactual reality, we can look at what Tibetans are doing and what knowledge that they draw on. So first, I want to emphasize here that Tibetans are neither native ecologists or natural environmental warriors, which is often the label given to indigenous populations. Tibetans speak about the environment in very different ways. They don't always fit perfectly into the dominant Western language, but Tibetans are conveniently environmentally conscious because they use normative ethical frameworks that build in self-surveillance and accountability when they engage with land and nature. And you have to remember really importantly that they don't rely on financial incentives or fines to manage or regulate their relationship with nature. And what's really important here is I wanted to emphasize that Tibetan word for politics in the root word is the word for water. So we recognize the importance of water in distribution of power and resources. And I want to talk briefly about the traditional cosmology that informs our relationship to nature. So the first is the concept of the container and its contents, and the idea that the world is the container and all the inhabitants are the contents, and that we live in an interdependent relationship, which is a very common ethos. And second is the idea that the landscape is inhabited by spirits and deities that can be both malevolent or benevolent. And from this, we actually get the system of sacred sites, and sacred sites are often very well monitored, regulated, and protected. And the final concept within our cosmology is the Buddhist principles, where while there is no overarching single philosophy around Buddhist environmental ideas, the concepts of no self, interdependence, karma, they really shape a broad policy approach of treating all animals equally. So what does this mean on the ground when we translate this cosmology to land management and land use? Well, what we're seeing is actually Tibetans are rejecting a lot of this capitalist Chinese government policies to privatize land, to atomize communities and households. And what they're doing is they're trying to return to communal living practices, land use practices, to share the risks and the benefits of living on the grasslands. And in particular, we've seen case studies of Tibetans reverting to this in response to grassland degradation, in response to glacial lake expansion. And this is a counter-argument to the common understanding of the tragedy of commons, that individuals overuse and will be selfish in the use of common public goods. And the other case study I want to draw on is the sacred sites. We've seen Tibetans on their own voluntarily monitor and regulate sacred sites to prevent hunting, to prevent fishing, to manage the conservation of native wildlife, as well as vegetation. And this system is expanding. When Tibetans are given the opportunity to design their own responses to local challenges, these are the types of policies or models or interventions that they're coming up with. And there are more, but we don't have all the time today. But I want to emphasize that one of the major goals or foundations of Chinese government policies in development and also in building an ecological civilization is removing Tibetans from the land, and that is removing a really valuable partner as a frontline defense against changes in the environment. They're the ones who know when something is irregular in the environment, and they're the ones who stay there, who aren't remotely traveling there every few months to monitor changes. And finally, I want to close by emphasizing, if we want to build a sustainable water and land policy, we need to create vitality and resilience in the environment. And that relies on really first investing in the vitality and resilience of the people. And that means empowering people to protect their environment and also emphasizing the critical role that language and cultural rights has in carrying traditional knowledge, in supporting the traditional systems of governance, and also allowing local populations to build and preserve their social and community bonds. Because that is how decisions are made, that's how people are mobilized, and action is implemented. And right now the reality is there's a strategic campaign by the Chinese government to break the ties that bind Tibetans to their land, to each other, and to their history. And I just want to emphasize this quote by Dr. Yunta Nyima, who is a Tibetan geographer. And when talking about grassland policies, he says, Tibetan pastoralists are entrapped into accepting decisions made by others with little space for participation in policy making. Hence, the problem is political rather than technical in nature. So I think when we talk about the region as Asia's water tower, as the Himalayas, we need to talk about Tibetans and the political position that they're in, unable to really have a say in how their land is changing. I have policy recommendations, which maybe I can get into in more detail, but primarily governments in the region need to cooperate on data sharing. There needs to be more collaboration on the ground and marrying quantitative data with qualitative data. And then we also need to promote the opening up of Tibetan Plateau, because it is an incredibly isolated region for political reasons, when really this region is of such importance to almost 1/5 of the global population. So we can't afford for this information, for this region to be isolated. And then just for local policy recommendations, we need to be able to empower locals. So they need to know what their legal rights are, how they can legitimately and without fear of prosecution raise concerns about the environment. And also we need to record and invest in recording traditional knowledge and practices to build partnerships with local communities. I'll close there, sorry for that.
Great. Thank you, Palmo. I had a follow-up question, but she already answered it, so I'm just going to move on, and maybe we can circle back in the discussion space for some more follow-ups. And so we are, I don't want to say running behind, because it's like we got plenty of time. Marina, would you please join us here and give us your thoughts?
Great. Well, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the technical piece and how we can bring together these quantitative and qualitative indicators and try to understand situations from kind of both the technical side and from the lived experiences of people in all parts of the watershed. So just a little bit of background. At SEI, water research and planning are not only an avenue for more sustainable development, but a means for resolving conflict between countries and local parties in a way that addresses competing needs among both humans and ecosystems. We aim to drive innovation in water management by developing and implementing tools and participatory processes for water managers and stakeholders. So to strengthen cooperation around water at SEI, we employ our philosophy, which focuses on the importance of both technical information and as well as improving diplomatic relations. Our robust decision support, RDS, methodology invokes an iterative process between bringing stakeholders, often with different and sometimes conflicting interests and perspectives, together to the table. We work with water managers who face many challenges related to the complexity of physical hydrology, ecological concerns, socioeconomic activities, and competing objectives related to multiple water uses, and such as human consumption, cultural and recreational activities, irrigation, energy production, and ecosystems. In addition, climate change augments those challenges by making the estimation of future characteristics of the system deeply uncertain. To help stakeholders and decision makers understand these interactions between all the uncertainties, we translate data, models, and processes into visualizations and narratives that allow for better validation and engagement. So we rely much of the time on the XLRM framework developed by RAND to guide the numerical modeling tools that we use to inform policy. And this focuses on 4 components of the modeling process. So first, understanding the exogenous uncertainties, which are factors outside of decision makers' control. These include climate change, demographics, and demand for water and energy. Additionally, we also look at the policy levers, right? So what water managers can use in terms such as near-term actions and strategies, such as investment plans, reoperation of existing infrastructure, or support for users throughout the watershed. Next, there's the modeling of the relationships themselves. So these are processes or connections between hydrogeologic, societal, and economic systems that describe the setting that we're interested in. And then finally, we look at the metrics or indicators that are the performance standards which we use to evaluate whether or not a choice of policy levels achieves decision makers' goals. So we at SEI developed the Water Evaluation and Planning System, WEAP, W-E-A-P, which is a modeling platform for use in mapping out watersheds and future conditions. WEAP is a powerful analytical platform that links hydrologic processes, system operations, and end-use patterns. Under our approach, the model helps guide the conversations toward the answer rather than directly providing the answer itself. These conversations are where the hard work really happens to build consensus on how to manage the watershed. The tool is accessible with a built-in geospatial interface, automatic download of global data sets like climate and land use, strong scenario management, internal cost-benefit analyses, linkages with other models, and advanced scripting capability. Oh, okay. Actually, I think that might be, yeah. Okay, crisis averted. With this in mind, an important aspect of numerical modeling, right? We have all this technology, We have mathematical representations of many different processes. We're able to do things like agent-based modeling, where we model human interactions. But all of this is really quite useless if the people who manage, live in, and experience the basin have no understanding of what the model is doing and what the results really mean for their lives. One important aspect of bringing this kind of to the people is web-based tools and serious games. So my colleagues yesterday presented during the session Crossing the Boundaries, Participatory Tools to Co-Manage Watersheds and Ecosystems. And you can see that online. And so one example of the use of WEEP for serious games and web-based tools is the Swarm platform. This offers users access to a simplified interface that can display a 3D map of the catchment area and future basin management options. So to customize for the region, country stakeholders were consulted to select the options embedded in the model. Server Mekong worked with the stakeholders to develop the model for catchments along the lower Mekong that are considered to be hotspots. And then this approach ensures that stakeholders play a major role in both tool development and eventual ownership. And this, in turn, promotes long-term stability and progress. The novelty of this tool in particular lies in the fact that it can be used by both technical and non-technical stakeholders who have no modeling experience. And this allows for feedback and participation by diverse users. In addition to accessibility, the tools themselves must provide a realistic representation of the complex systems they intend to resolve. So integrated modeling is often really useful when we're looking at different parts of the system. So representing between disciplines is increasingly necessary to ensure that there's feedback between decisions that are made in various sectors. So this can mean representing relationships in water resources management systems, such as using the WEEP model, as well as energy production systems. This could be in the terms of renewable energy sources, hydroelectric energy sources, conventional fossil fuel-based energy production systems, and kind of changing between these different energy sources, and then finally connecting that up with a macroeconomic model that can represent the financial impacts of each of these decisions on different areas throughout the watershed. So here we can see how these models can interrelate and the relationships between them through modeling systems that allow feedback between the systems. So we can imagine that the water model will give us an idea about the crop production based on the precipitation or the water that's available for irrigation, as well as the water that's available for industrial uses, and then this feeds into the economic model that then can tell us what is actually being produced and what the financial implications of these water realities are. And similarly, understanding the stream flow that's available and the water pumping needs then can feed into energy systems to be able to understand kind of how much energy is produced, which energy sources are most able to adapt to the changes in stream flow. For example, with increased climate change, hydroelectric is going to be less reliable, and so we might need to, it is more viable to be relying on renewable sources that aren't water dependent. So one example of the implementation of integrated water, energy, food, ecosystem modeling is in the transboundary Sir Darya river basin in Central Asia. So such integrated modeling can help foster economic stability and water security. So results from this modeling effort showed that Central Asia's hydropower is best studied linking energy, water, and economic models that encompass competing water demands and alternative energy supplies. Additionally, integrated modeling demonstrates the economic consequences of climate-related constraints on agricultural production. And then finally, the inclusion of economic analysis expands the scope of water and energy planning to encompass the whole economy, including benefits of using resources more efficiently. On the other hand, we can think back to our XLRM framework and try to understand kind of what are the data that we have and what are the data that we're missing. So in a project trying to understand balancing fisheries and rice irrigation in Cambodia, we developed a WEEP model initially based on the limited data that was available, and then were alerted to the fact that there were quite a lot of processes that were not represented within the model because of a lack of data. And specifically, looking at the system from a multidimensional poverty analysis perspective, we came to understand that the representation of the lived experiences of the farmers and fishers within the system were not properly represented. So we went back and used the multidimensional poverty analysis framework in combination with the initial WEEP model to begin to ask some of these questions and develop out some of the data that we would need. So this included going to key experts within the basin, conducting a literature review, and then taking from this a number of questions to a household survey. In the household survey, the upper, middle, and lower watershed populations were surveyed, which included 45 villages, 810 households, and this was to try to understand kind of what actually they were experiencing. And most importantly, this revealed that, one, there was a seasonality in the cropping decisions that was happening that was not originally represented in the model. And secondly, that depending on where individuals were located within the basin, there was more or less irrigation supply access. And so this priority was not represented, and it came to be apparent that certain households within the basin were receiving much less irrigation water than others based on where they were placed within the basin. And so these kinds of efforts, while they can be an additional cost, they can really help to make clear how the system is truly operated and who is benefiting most from changes in the system. Secondly, if we think about from the beginning of the modeling process and kind of at that, and then also how we're evaluating the output from the models, we can think about that M, or the metrics or indicators within the modeling process, and really including indigenous voices and local voices from the evaluation and the determination of the indicators that are being used. And so when in the case of a lithium mining study in Argentina, the research priority was to come to the communities, follow indigenous community procedures and time necessary to carry out consultation, right? So consultation isn't just going and doing a survey necessarily. There might be many different steps in the process to consult indigenous communities and their systems and their governing systems, and allow for time for them to also consult within their own communities, ensuring that the research respects community interests and comfort, and especially going to the communities themselves. Oftentimes we talk about providing a seat at the table for local groups, indigenous communities, vulnerable populations, but many times those individuals it's difficult for them to travel. They have responsibilities. They're closed off from kind of these public spaces. And so actually going to the individuals and the communities themselves and traveling and building these relationships relationships over time is really vital to really understanding kind of the processes and the impacts that are important to these communities. So we conducted expert interviews with local partners to understand the context and design the survey that we implemented, then initialized contact with Indigenous communities to develop the interview plan, and then finally worked with the local partners to carry out the interviews and coding the results. So thank you. And with a mindful application of water management tools, we can cultivate peace and sustainability globally.
Thank you very much. And so you already alluded to this, but I'll just kind of bring it to more of a fine point, considering the context that we're in, that, you know, the access is one aspect, but then there's also not only marginalized, but there's really people that are being oppressed, right? So that's being actively kept from the table. And so I, you know, was curious that how does, you know, SEI specifically include such factors into the water modeling and the process? You know, how does that interact with human rights violations, and how does SEI confront that?
Yeah, so one tool that we use that has a very clear methodology, science-based methodology, is the multidimensional poverty analysis, the MDPA, which I mentioned earlier. And this really allows us to look at many different dimensions of vulnerability, and this includes voice, this includes the oppression or impacts to security, safety, and health of individuals and communities. And so it is important to really pull out each of these elements and try to identify what each community is experiencing, because all communities are very different, and not all vulnerable communities are vulnerable in the same aspects. And so trying to understand kind of what is most relevant and necessary for the community of interest is really important to then modeling and working with those individuals.
Thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, Pat, you're up. And before Pat gets started, I really want to emphasize that we're very privileged to have her here. She has jumped in, no pun intended, or really pun intended, for one of her colleagues who had a very personal and critical situation. So we're very grateful that she was able to come here, learn a little bit about Tibet, and offer her a unique perspective from her tribe and how it might apply. So thank you for coming in and helping us.
Well, you two have, I was in a grade 3 class, and I'm telling oral stories, and one boy comes up to me, he goes, "Did you make my head big?" I said, "Yeah," he said. I said, "It makes you think?" So you've definitely done that, and I can see some relationship between the Tibet people and my First Nation. So are you very lucky today, because I got 10,000 years to do in 5 minutes? Okay, and my phone keeps shutting off because it's not that I don't know the subject, it's just that I don't want to miss one of them because it has pretty well what to do with it. I come from the Tagish Deni, and it's the beginning of the Yukon River. It runs through the Yukon, 3,200 kilometers, and right into the Bering Sea, goes right through Alaska. It is one of the biggest runs of the king salmon. And for thousands and thousands of years, our indigenous people relied on the river for transportation, for spirituality, for food, and for identity. And I'm going to get into that. We also have the greatest respect for everything, and everything on earth is alive. The river is alive. It has a purpose. And now the most respect that we have is not just to water, but to the mountains. The mountains is the most precious thing in our traditional territory. Can someone tell me why? And not to the person that heard me. Because it is the mountains that give life. They're not a pile of rock. They're not dead. That's what we understand in science, right? Non-living things, living things. Well, our mountains are alive. They're the only ones that talk to the sky, the air, the land, and they communicate. Snow is on them, and they communicate with seasons. Snow starts up in the mountains. Pretty soon, spring starts coming. They start dribbling, little bit of water, big water, start making creeks, start making rivers, all tributaries start running into the big Yukon River, all rivers. And pretty soon it's one great big river. They run into lakes, and they run into the ocean, all salt water. So when I talk about connections, that's what it is. Connections to everything. You can't take one and hurt one because you'll hurt all. And that's our beliefs. And I'm going to go into our traditional laws here. So respect, connection, the highest respect is to our mountains because they're the one that gives us life, gives us water, and the connection. So our traditional laws, I come from a strong traditional law. As you can see, I am wolf because I'm on the land. And I'm killer whale, so I'm saltwater people too. And in the air, I'm eagle. I can wear those clans. In the Yukon, we have 2 clans. I come from the wolf clan, and then there's the crow clan. And those are our traditional laws. When you see us, it's not for decoration. Some people got masks and totem poles, they're beautiful. It's not for direction, it's identity, and it tells you who you are. In our traditional governance system, we're a matriarchal society, means we own the children, clan. You follow the mother. We do not take the father's clan. So when Crow made the world, he said some of it, when he brought light to the world, he steals the sun and moon and the stars and he brings light to the world. And he said all the animals got scared. Everybody got scared. And we were one-time animals too. We were, the fish were humans too. We could speak the same language and we could transform into each other. These are our beliefs, our values. Our oral stories are not fairy tales, they're the truth. So when he steals the sun and the moon, some animals ran in the water. That's where I get the killer whale. Some animals took off in the air. That's where I get the bird. So you see, some animals, what's the other one? Ran on the land. They become the wolves, wolf, caribou. And I'm not going to talk about the Crow clan because somebody has to be here to be talking about the Crow clan. So one of them stood right there, never moved. He was the human. Crow told him, you walk like me now, on 2 legs. He said, but for women, we never leave our community. So all along the Yukon River, many tribes along the Yukon River from Alaska into the Yukon, we pretty well live, we're river people, we're salmon people. So we live there. But in my traditional territory, we all have names. We give different names. So that, when I don't move, I was born in Marsh Lake, the headwaters of the dam and the Yukon River, and for thousands of years we lived there. The women, my grandmother's wolf, my mother's wolf, I'm wolf, my children are wolf, and I have 3 daughters and 1 boy. So my 3 daughters will stay and not move. Now my son, now I'm going to be lucky. I'm going to pick husbands for my crow husbands for my children, my 3 daughters. I'm going to pick the toughest, because we had wars too. I'm going to get them to marry the Tlinkits. They're going to protect. Now those Tlingit men have to come to my community He has his job as a crow man. He has to be crow. He can't be wolf. Crow clan. He has to come and protect me, my children, my family, my community. So, for an example, now my son, we're going to negotiate with him now to go to, say, another community. So he marries. He goes, he's now wolf. He has to marry a crow woman. So he's maybe 100 miles away. We go to war with their community. His job is to go to war. He has to fight me. Do you think we're going to fight? I'm going to do everything I can because he has my grandchildren. So you see some of the piece. Okay. So that's traditional law. But because I stay right one place, the land I have inherited for thousands of years. During colonialism now, I'm having a hard time hanging on to it. So the water was our food, our livelihood, all kinds of fish, everything was in our water. It was survival. So spirituality, everything is alive. We connect to everything. We know who we are. We know who we are. We have our own languages. Unfortunately, I've lost mine. So I think we talk about the 10,000 years. Did I do that in 3 minutes? So we even had treaties between First Nations, and you can see by the crow and wolf. We had our own traditional forms of government, the crow and wolf. Okay, I can't get into it, but like I said, we're a matriarchal society, and we were very, very important in our community as leaders. We didn't have time to be chiefs. We just helped some. You go ahead and be chief, But we were. But then, just listening to your presentation, the Tibet people seem to have the same values as us. We're environmentalists. We lived here thousands of years, never left a footprint. And then overnight, 100 years ago, 100, not 5,000 years, not 500 years, like here in Sweden, we had the gold rush. Someone discovered gold rush. And unfortunately, it was the person that was my first cousin, my grandmother's first cousin, First Nation person, along with George Carmack's. And they discovered the gold. And I think around that time, the whole world came to the Yukon. So roughly 20,000 newcomers came. And the genocide, assimilation, and the worst one was the Indian Act. It was run by the churches and the government. Anybody ever heard of the Indian Act or residential schools? I am third descendant of residential school. So there is a lot of damage still today. It is alive and well, and the Indian Act is still there. Even though we have self-government and land claims agreement, we still use the Indian Act too. It has some good and has some bad. The residential school was the worst. In my traditional territory, which is the capital of the Yukon is in, we were relocated 7 times. So every time the land became valuable, they forced us off, including with the railway and the White Pass Railroad, the steamboats were coming in. We were at forced relocations. Then under the Indian Act, they had reserves. So remember, we're nomadic people. We went where the animals went. We had our food. We looked for our food during seasons. Each season, we had our special camps. Then we were put on reserves, and we could not leave them. We're forced. We would go to jail, whatever. We were not allowed to leave. So we were confined to reservations, and our children were taken away. So then comes the Alaska Highway. The Alaska Highway was built in 1942. It was based on the Second World War. The Japanese were flying into Alaska, and so the Americans built the Alaska Highway. And my traditional territory and where I was born on the trap line, where my mom and grandmother were born, 30,000 American men show up. So that was the end of the wolf and the crow culture. It started, a big damage was done to that. In the residential schools, they said we're not First Nation. So, and then in 1958, another part was a dam being built. We had no say. And when it was built, backed up the water, and the Yukon River in front of Whitehorse and downriver, the fish were backed up in it. And it was migrating, the king salmon were migrating, and there were hundreds of thousands of king salmon were blocked behind it. They built a fish ladder, but for thousands of years, they never knew. Remember, animals are human too. They never knew there was a fish ladder. So the other day was just hearing the short numbers of fish. It's very heartbreaking. One of the youth spoke of the salmon, said that was the first time she was seen a salmon, and she said, my brother will not see it. So now we also getting very, very strong. Around 1970s, they wanted to put a pipeline through from Alaska underwater. There were several routes, right? And we managed to stop it as First Nation Indigenous people. And then we started negotiations for land claims and self-government. Our community has it. It's not the best. We had a large land base. We got a little postage stamp in the map, but it was the best we could do. And we have some rights now. They're trying to build a dam, and they're consulting. And for us Indigenous people who had 100 years of colonialism and trying to find our way back, we will not be talking about people. We will be talking about our plants, and we'll be talking about our animals, and we'll pray for guidance from them too. So they are alive, and we were there, we're for them. I'd like to pass one more on to you. It's the Doctrine of Discovery of 1400. Does anybody know what that one is? So it allowed Christian explorers to claim land for the king and queen. So gave them excuse, okay. And there was another good one. So we're just finding out things now, because I got to see the Pope. Terra nullius. I don't even know how to pronounce it. Can you help me? Yeah. No one owns this land prior to Europeans. Canada is a very, very rich country. We all know that, right? Do we? Then how come the Indigenous people are the most poor? Thank you.
So at this point, I would love to actually, don't go anywhere, Pat, bring everybody back up so we can open up for some discussion. I don't really want to call it question and answer because that kind of isn't what we're hoping. Yes, so we're hoping that all of you, and if there are folks online, I'm not a technical genius, so I didn't think of setting up in advance an invitation to please participate by chat or send in any questions. But if you do have them, where can they send them?
I mean, we will look at it.
Okay.
And, if there are any questions the audience have, then I will just pass around the mic.
Right.
And,
but they're monitoring the online chat section, so please weigh in if you're out there in the ether. We'll be happy to integrate you guys in because that's all part of the fun. So we're going to do something I hope is a little different for this non-question and answer is please feel free to ask your question. And I do really encourage it to be a question. And then you can direct it to any panelist or general who can discuss it. But if you have a follow-up that you would like to ask or comment on, shortly, let's try to make this a conversation so it's not question, 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 right? And if you, and that's what we hope so we can all come away with having really learned from each other and that there's an exchange. So if y'all can do it, we're going to do it. So if you want to start us off, who wants to take the plunge? Please.
I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name in the centre there. So earlier on, you were talking about ensuring you're going into the communities and talking there. How are you ensuring that you're not creating more damage? Like, are you ensuring that the community is being looked after while you're there, in a sense? Because sometimes people go in, they're doing the research, and you ask them, well, did you help, provide for the community? Because you've changed some of the relationships while you've been there. And they go, oh, but there'll be future benefits to them from our research. Now, more often than not, the future benefit is to the researcher. So how are you sort of accounting for that? You did sort of allude to that, but I'm curious to hear more. And it's the same for people that come into your community, Patricia, from the government. How are they ensuring that you're not losing out, in a way, by them being there, on this assumption of future benefit?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, and this goes back to that last slide, is more and more now really respecting the self-governance and responding to the requirements of the community itself. So I think that's the first phase, is really making sure that you know the steps, who is a representative. A lot of consultation will go in and ask, anyone in the community what their thoughts are, and then take that as that's what the community wants and that's the representation. And so being clear that if any data is collected in a way that doesn't, is about experiences and perspectives, that doesn't necessarily mean a representation of what the community needs and specifically is asking for and requiring. And then the second part of that is, as a research organization, we do have an ethics process that is meant to evaluate all these potential risks and go to the community with this, be very clear about kind of the questions that we're going to be asking, how those are going to be used. And that's kind of more on the research side, but really it's important to bring in the communities from the beginning and see what is it that they're interested in learning about their own environment, their own setting. Obviously, they have vast knowledge of their place and thousands of years of experience often, and so trying to see kind of how these projects that are being implemented or being considered might impact them is also of value to them, right? And Pat, maybe you can speak to the consultation.
Well, before they didn't consult with us when they built the first dam, but now we have land claims and self-government agreements. You must consult with us. And economic opportunities, we have chapter 14 is management of water. Another chapter I can't quote right off of it is thick book if you want me to pull it out. Legal jargon that says economic opportunities. So within our traditional territory, we'll definitely have economic opportunities. But our beliefs today is not the economic opportunities. It's about how we speak for the fish and how we speak. That's our economic opportunities. That's our health. That's our well-being. So, no, I hope I'm speaking for my chief and council right now. You don't know I just said this, but I'm backing. I know my chief is a very traditional man, and he's a young man, and he has a lot of get up and go, let's put it. He's newly elected, but I know that he'd be thinking about the plants and the fish, and he knows his language, so he knows more than me. Thank you.
Oh, please.
I think that's a really great question about benefits to the community, and it's an issue that we've also seen in researchers that go into Tibet and they have their special studies, but then you realize, okay, was this a purely one-directional relationship? Is this just extractive? And even I've had that experience doing research, and you realize, I think we need to really set a higher standard for researchers to say, okay, if you're going to do research in this area, you have a duty to understand where the locals are coming from, what they might be interested in, how can you help them in some way, how can you give back to them in some way, that repays what they're giving you, whatever that is, where your research being published or being recognized as an expert on the region. But I really think you need to give locals an opportunity to maybe design their own project, and you can facilitate them in that process, or help them find ways to carve out greater areas of autonomy where it is possible, or to be creative within their restricted political environment. And I think this needs to start really early at university level to teach young researchers. Yes, we go through ethics training, but then once you publish, you forget about, what have you left behind for the people that you've been interviewing. So I think it's a practice we also need for data scientists, remote sensing specialists, for them to think, okay, who's living on the ground? What stories am I telling from above? And to acknowledge that their research is limited still, especially even in the scientific papers where you want to be quantitative. I think you still have to acknowledge the people on the ground and just say, we don't have a full picture, this is what we're seeing from above.
I would just add to that, in the research one, we talk about interdisciplinary, but we also need to think about kind of working with different types of organizations, different types of civil representation groups, and something that we always try to do, and generally it is the most successful, is working with local researchers, local organizations, understanding the perspective, and understanding kind of who we can go to and who we can talk to, and getting the context before kind of designing the research project. So really designing the research project around the situation on the ground, rather than coming in with a methodology and the questions that we have to be answered. Obviously, we're also working with water managers and decision makers, often at the national or regional level. And so they have specific questions or data that they're interested in. And so trying to bridge that gap and really making that clear is really valuable.
Well, actually, I want to make sure that we can do this thing. Is there anybody else in the audience who wants to, engage with that one?
No, I'm going to ask something different.
Just, does anybody else want to just go engage with that question, or we want to move on a little bit? So I actually am going to use my moderator prerogative, is that it? Because there was something that was said in another panel, and I think you were there for it, and it was actually on another one related to Tibet as well. Two things keep coming up, which is there's data, and there's the interviewing, and there's the conversations that we just outlined, and we're also hearing a lot, right, about the function and belief systems of different peoples, First Nation, or maybe even, we don't have to limit that to just First Nations, but have you experienced with, and what would you recommend when we bring, people to the table of ensuring that the spiritual or the belief systems are as incorporated and valued as, please tell us your traditional knowledge about plants?
That was yeah. We're consulted. We're consulted 24/7, and it's sometimes they come in to consult and say they consult, but now we have court action that you have to consult with delete some words now. Means you can't just consult and say you consult and then go ahead and do it. And remember, we're a small community. We're in largest in the Yukon, our community. Like I'm trying to speak. But we're well aware, and I think we could pretty well stop any project that hurts our livelihood or our, but yes, we have gone through what people said they've been consulting, and they still go ahead, and no Indigenous knowledge is in it. But just because they consulted with you, they didn't. But we're lucky we have our land claims and self-government agreements that enforces it. But we still have to watch. We still have to be on our toes. We still want our input. So with this project, one of the biggest projects coming is going to be the building of a new dam. And, you know, spirituality is going to be hard for the consultants and to understand what we're saying. And the most important, though, how is it connected? How did it affect that bear? He can't eat any more salmon. How come that eagle is floating around and digging in our garbage? You know, so those are the kind of consulting. And when they say the 7 years generation, is this dam going to last 7 years and not harm the next 7 years generation? I don't know. I don't have all the answers either. But we do believe in spirituality, and we believe in the relationship of our non-Aboriginal friends. They want the same thing too, so it's much more different now than it was 60 years ago when they built a dam for economic reasons, and it was for their houses and for electricity. I'm not saying that I don't like electricity. I don't want to go back. But if it means that we have to stop the dam because of harm to more of our animals, we got to think of them. And the water. Hey, we all drink water. So we have a lot of good partners now. Thank you.
Oh, you can start. Yeah, it's a really tough question. How do you incorporate traditional spiritual knowledge into with data? So obviously it's qualitative, but I think spiritual and traditional knowledge can have quantitative or real on-the-ground effects or impacts. So often sacred sites correlate with sort of very significant landmarks that are luscious in vegetation or with biodiverse ecosystems. So obviously there is an overlap, but I think the element where traditional knowledge comes in is it really comes into how you manage the land, right? So it's not so much about necessarily only collecting information on what's happening, but also what happens next. What are the long-term policies that are needed to introduce sustainable policies or sustainable practices? And traditional knowledge gives you that, or traditional practices and that philosophy gives you the tools to realize a sustainable land and water management policy. So I think you have to remember it comes later too. It's the next step once you figure out what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, from a modeling perspective, right, we're trying to represent the relationships, uncertainties, specific quantitative information. And so kind of the best way that we can do that in these models is, again, going back to those indicators and the metrics. So in terms of kind of what this really means from a water resources perspective, we need to know kind of what are the species that are important, what are the temporal needs, right? So when does there need to be cool water to be able to do, either ceremonies or specific practices? Are there harmful algal blooms that are going to be affecting the ability of the indigenous people to interact with the water? Kind of what are the real impacts on their cultural and spiritual activities and their livelihoods?
Sorry, as you were speaking, I just thought of a really, really revealing case study or research that was done between anthropologists and geographers, and they found that the scientific measures of grassland degradation on the Tibetan Plateau was misrepresenting the realities on the ground, that locals on the ground were saying, okay, this might look degraded to you from above, but actually it's not. You know, this is in transition, and in maybe 2 cycles or 2 years, it will regrow and it'll be really healthy and we can use it again. And so that's showing where you obviously need to include, you can really meaningfully, practically include that traditional knowledge. But there are special cases and every case is different.
Oh, I feel like there's
you.
people waiting, so please.
Can you hear me? So thank you for being here. There have been a couple of panels about the Himalayas and glaciers, and I have been in some of them with you. And in many of them, including anthropologists, they have underlined the benefits of hydropower also for local communities. They didn't mention Tibetans, but they just said local communities. We've been following, though, in the press how there is growing resistance to these projects. So my question, the first question that I have is that protest coming from the scale of the projects? Or more broadly, what is the human rights, how does it affect the human rights of the communities in the region? Because I mean, I agree that everyone wants electricity now, but I just wanted to know if there is any other alternative for how is the local communities feeling with that. The second question is about the crackdown in Tibet. I represent the global citizen movement. We have joined forces before with indigenous peoples. We constantly do with the Tibetan resistance, but it's always difficult to do so because of the security concerns. It's hard to point out a global campaign or just direct the public eye into one conflict or one specific community, knowing the crackdown that is coming up. So the second question for you is, I don't feel we do have the agency to pitch you ideas on how to help, but I'm here to listen what it is that you need and to help as much as possible. So if you have any tip about how we could join forces or how can a global movement help fight for what your communities are fighting for in a way that does not threaten the people in the territory, I'll be very happy to hear it. Thank you.
Oh wow, that's incredible to hear. So thank you for your support. The first question about hydropower dams and protests. So I think the main issue is the benefits. Where do the benefits go, and is it really necessary? Because some of the dams we agree that some hydropower dams maybe are necessary in areas where there is not much electricity, and we're not going to necessarily contest that. But of course, we need we need to hear from local communities. But the more recent protests in Dege come in relation to a mega dam, a very large dam that's going to inundate 6 monasteries 50 kilometers upstream. So the question is, are locals going to benefit from this? Because really, if you look at the installed power capacity, it's designed for downstream and also regions in central and eastern China. So the benefits will largely go to urban living residents, and then the costs will obviously affect the local communities, and especially local communities who are very intimately tied to their land, as well as the monasteries, which are centuries old and that survived the Cultural Revolution, invasion. And so I think the key question here we have to recognize is the cost and benefit analysis for local communities and whether they are consulted. Because I'm sure they would also agree that, yes, we want electricity, but at the cost of our land, our homes, our communities, and our monasteries and our history and culture. That's the key one. And in terms of, your challenges in working on Tibet, we have the same challenges, of course. Although we have connections inside Tibet, it's always hard to get information. There are other ways that we can work together creatively to do more research, to elevate the voices of Tibetans when they do take this enormous risk to get information out about dam projects, mining projects, or new policies around nature reserve sites. And I want to add here that a lot of the issues on research on Tibet is, especially in the environmental space, is data is considered like a national security issue. So even data, I recently realized, trying to do research on mapping nature reserves, that's all a national security secret. So even though the state is saying we're developing an ecological civilization, we're transitioning to renewable energy economy, but we're not going to tell you where any of our nature reserve sites are or what we're protecting, because what are the risks? It's really confusing. So I think we need to keep advocating for the region to highlight the importance of the region for downstream countries and for Tibetans as well, and to say we need to access Tibet, and it's both political and environmental. So we need to highlight both elements, because some people only see Tibet through a political lens, and some see it as an environmental issue, but not Tibet, it's the Himalayas. So we need to connect the two, because that's the only way you really do achieve some sort of regional transboundary praxis.
And I can't help myself. So I am going to do this, because it's been sort of, yes, just, okay. Go ahead, okay. Because one thing that has come up a little bit here, and I won't go on too long, and because it is sort of a leading, is, because you're right? It's several panels in a row. It's almost been talked about like the hydroelectric power is inevitable, right? And there's nothing else that can be done. I think if people look closely at growing climate science and, on the costs and effects, which, we put that slide up there, that there's so many costs, right? And that there actually is a lot of science that the dams themselves can be bad for the climate. So they may not be any solution. In fact, so if you put that together, why aren't we looking more at what are the genuinely green solutions? There's not just in Tibet, the Yukon, wherever in the world, right here in Canada, United States, there's so much shift and movement going towards solar and wind and efficiency that inherently don't carry those risks. So audience members, panelists, anybody want to kind of open up that conversation, because I think it's one that is also being here has been a little bit, frankly, glossed over. So I felt responsible to raise it, and we can talk about it to wherever people are comfortable, or we can move on to something else.
Actually, my question was about the energy transition.
Well,
I'm not kidding, very much connected with your comment, right? I mean, we need to transition to greener, cleaner technologies. We know that. But at the same time, and it needs to happen now. It needs to happen soon. And with that reasoning, it's happening at the expense of the most vulnerable, and not really looking at the environmental implications. I mean, yes, you were talking about, what about solar? What about wind energy? Though there's some impacts of wind energy in some places. So, right. So I think it's not which type of, or critical minerals, lithium, Marina was talking about that. It's how this can happen without affecting the poorest or the most vulnerable. And I would love to hear from the panel about that.
Yeah, I think specifically speaking to that example of the lithium mining in the salt flats in Argentina, I think kind of looking at that, right, the indigenous communities there have cell phones, they use lithium-ion batteries, and so there's the sense like, oh, well, you're also benefiting, right, by having a lithium mine. But the reality is that it's a global pressure that's causing the mining of lithium in these areas. And that global pressure, we know the main factor of that is single occupancy vehicles that need to be switching over from fossil fuels to lithium-ion batteries. And part of that question about equitable transitions and what is the necessity of these mining projects or hydroelectric projects is the policy choice lithium or fossil fuel, or is there another option of public transit that can reduce single occupancy vehicle necessity, or the localization of our communities so that you don't have to be driving long distances every day to go to work or school, or those needs, and co-locating commercial activities with living residential areas. So I think that having these discussions about either or, and these are the options, and kind of that's all that we look at in the name of it needs to happen now, it needs to happen today, it needs to happen yesterday, is the expediency, is part of this issue, the mindset that really got us into these crises in the first place.
Or did you want to? Okay, still thinking. Yes, I think the renewable energy transition question is a really important one, and I think we're not going to be absolutists and say no hydropower, but it all comes back to consultation and the cost-benefit analysis. And from what we've seen, hydropower dams have huge costs that affect local, or disproportionately affect local communities. Solar and wind options should be more seriously considered. And I think if local communities are consulted about their options, and if they weigh up what they think benefits them and the environment, and also potentially has benefits downstream as well, then I think they would come up with a sustainable solution. So I think that's what we're calling for, and also for those political and civil rights, so that they are empowered to speak up, and have the opportunity without fear of persecution. And I think that's something we still have to remember, especially when we're talking in relation to China and the dramatic renewable energy transition. I mean, it's really commendable, but then at what cost? Because hydropower is playing a huge part in this project, and nobody's thinking about where that's coming from. And there's even ambitious plans to potentially export it to Southeast Asian countries. So the benefits go even further away at the real cost of the Tibetan communities and nation.
You get the last word.
My First Nation just bought the what do you call windmills? It's on a mountain. 3 great big ones and I think we can probably partnership up with the dam. Hey, you can't handle it? Partner with us, we'll take over. Yeah. So we're planning ahead. It's not, it's hard to a community that has been traumatized, and it's hard to understand that we have to invest money now to invest in the future. And we have to partnership with things that we don't like. We need economic opportunities. We need, it's a hard decision to come into the 21st century. But we want to use those beliefs and values that have sustained us for thousands of years. Thank you.
Okay, we are closing in on time, and as much as we'd like to stay here, I think that there's also transition to the next panel that will also have an online component, so I can't just look at the crowd and say, I'm staying. It's not my right. Sort of. No. So I was going to see if I could just I'm not going to try to do that thing where people summarize what we learned. I'm trying to see if I can just draw out a few points that we've heard from our panelists, the audience, and maybe throw in my own opinion. So I think that we definitely heard from Palmo of the situation, both the human rights and the environmental degradation, and some of the particular concerns about the People's Republic of China's approach and the impact it's having that's pretty hard to ignore as detrimental, both inside Tibet and downstream, where 1.8 billion people rely on these mountains, right? And so that needs to be addressed through consultation and including the political crisis. Okay, and then from Marina, I think really strong case for a model that SEI has that is goes beyond the I think more common approach of models from above, models that are very centered and really engage in a multi-phase process that, if I get it right, does include some of the key elements that elsewhere we have heard are problematic, is surveys that don't respect the processes and the governance structure and belief systems of the audience that is being asked, often overlooked. That the needs, and this was, I think, fascinating to me, the last answer, right? That the needs of what the spiritual systems how to integrate those so they're not considered, oh, well, that's the spiritual system, and we've asked about them, right? It's like that the specific example really stood out to me of, when does the water need to be cold in order to, for this religious practice, for spiritual practice to go forward? That is, to me, sounds like something that's rare and something that we can take away as a really good part of a different way of thinking. And now I'm doing the opining thing, but it was very, very impressive, and I think it stood out and illustrated the approach of mixing. That's what I heard, a deliberate mixing of the modeling, very, very scenario-driven, and really paying attention to people. And then from Pat, I heard a couple really important points. Was the nature and of the tradition and what it means and how it's been defined very clearly for so long, and including the connection to land, water, and not seeing each of those and wildlife as not being separate. And it's, I think, having been here, that the commonality between some of the things Palmo said as well about the Tibetan cosmology, and then commonality in the traumatic experiences. We could go through them, but railways, highways, residential school, mining, damming, right? So that parallel is a point that both said and said to each other. So I think that's something that's very powerful. And then again, the necessity of recognizing and confronting directly the human rights situations. So those are some points that I think everybody said, and I can't help myself, I'm just that kind of guy, as I think that one important aspect, and we did hear from the audience about some of those similar questions, especially about how to balance the clean energy transition. That's a huge topic everywhere, in this conference, outside of this conference. And so I really appreciate that part of the audience in, comments on, it's not about the formal, it's not about necessarily always the place specific, but how do we carry that out to achieve these goals? And I will still say that solar, wind, and efficiency are better. Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks.
Thank